Roronoa Zoro, or Zolo if you go by the official English translation. A titan of swordsmanship, the tails to Luffy's heads, the king of hell, and the man who swore to never lose again. Zoro has been through many trials and tribulations throughout his adventure on One Piece, but who amongst his many victims and adversaries gave him the most trouble? I'm going to be ranking these fights by how they occurred inside of the manga, not the anime, so any anime-specific feats or things that happen will not be accounted here amongst the rankings. So do note here, we're only going to be doing fights that Zoro actually won, so no Mihawk versus Zoro at the Baratie, no Kuma versus Zoro, and no Enel packing up Zoro for the one time. So the reason for this is most of those fights actually didn't amount to much combat-wise, and we're going to have some criteria that we make this list out of. We can't really rank it if there's nothing to judge the fight on. So for that very same reason, we will also be eliminating fights that Zoro won with absolutely no difficulty. So Zoro versus T-Bone won't be a factor in this list, and same thing with Zoro versus Monet. That's just not going to be here. Fights that occurred where Zoro wasn't one of the main combatants in the fight will also not be counted, as we're looking for a precise measure of Zoro's difficulty within the fight. Inconclusive fights like Zoro versus S-Hawk and Zoro versus Kaku and Egghead will not make the list either. There is one fight that has occurred in the manga that has not been animated as of yet, so for the anime onlys, I will leave a spoiler tag right before that entry comes up on the list, so do not feel like you can't watch this because you watch only the anime. We will give you a spoiler tag when the time comes. With all that laid out, let's get into the actual criteria on how we are ranking this list of fights here. How much damage Zoro actually took in the fight will be taken into account here. The amount of effort Zoro actually had to put into the fight, so his versatility of the opponent, the length of the fight, really any factors that came up that were more or less outside of Zoro and the opponent's control that made it just a little harder to etch that W over his opponent. And in classic Zoro fashion, this man is always in some physical ailment of some sort, so we will be taking his physical state going into the fight into account as well. If Zoro's incredibly injured going into a fight, and he still wins that fight with relative ease, that's going to weigh a lot against that particular opponent. Whereas if Zoro was somewhat injured and someone was taking advantage of that injury or something to that effect, if you're in a fight and your opponent is going for where you're hurting the most, that's going to make it a lot harder for you. So that's going to be a point for the opponent. What could give us more insight throughout this fight than anything else? Probably how Zoro's feeling about the fight. So anything that Zoro says or thinks while he's engaging in these fights, we're going to be including in the rankings as well. That is the criteria in which we are ranking these fights. If you like this type of content, please like the video. I would very much appreciate it. Subscribe to the page and hit that notification bell. So with the rules laid out and all the other junk out of the way, number 14, Hachi. Let me just start off by saying this. Hachi was absolutely trash in this fight against Zoro. Horrible. What, easily the worst performance here. Easily the worst performance. The biggest reason why Hachi ranks so low on this list is, well, Zoro's injury. He was fresh off of fighting Mihawk. He had that big scar on his chest. And frankly, Hachi's absolutely abysmal performance when they actually got to fighting as well. To give credit where it's due, when the fight initially started, it was one sword style Zoro versus an unarmed Hachi, so he did throw some hands at the very beginning of that fight. Hachi actually did have the advantage at this point in the fight. He was using the environment to his advantage. He even landed a flurry of blows on Zoro. However, all this goes out of the window when you realize just how bad Zoro was injured when this fight began. On top of saying Yosaku comment on the fact that Zoro's wound is making him feverish, Zoro also thinks the same thing. He said not only is his fever not going down, it's rising. There was even a point where Johnny stated if Zoro's wounds were to open in this fight, he'd probably die. And despite Hachi hitting him directly in the wound with a headbutt, he couldn't even open the wound. This man hit him directly in it, and he still couldn't open the wound. Once Zoro gets all of his swords back, it's essentially a pretty one-sided fight. With the exception of the headbutt that Hachi landed, all of his other moves got either blocked or parried in some way. There was even a point where Hachi threw Zoro in the air, and as he was coming down in a disadvantaged state, you would think, okay, this is a prime time. Hachi's gonna finally do something. And no, he absolutely gets sliced by Zoro. And perhaps the worst thing that justifies his ranking here is even after this fight, Zoro had enough strength to go and confront Arlong immediately afterwards. Okay, enough about Hachi. He's trash. We're moving on. Number 13, Baroque Works. So here we have our first jumping on the list, and certainly not our last jumping on the list. That really had no impact on Zoro's ability to dominate in this fight. Even though they really couldn't do much to Zoro physically wise, there was still a good amount of effort he had to apply in this fight. We saw him dodging, we saw him rolling out of the way, he was flipping over tables, we saw this man jumping over roofs like Spider-Man, and there was even a point where he got hit in the back of the head with the ladder. I mean, it didn't hurt him much, but he got hit. So we will give some credit here to the bounty hunters. Miss Monday did land a direct hit on Zoro's face, which It did make him bleed a little bit, but it was a very shallow wound, and let's be honest here, it only served to make Zoro look just that much more badass. Progressing on here, we did see Vivi hypnotize Zoro, which is something we don't often see in One Piece. And we also saw Zoro comment on the power of Ingram's shotgun. Ultimately, neither of which ended up being a big enough deal for Zoro to have to handle regardless. There was even a point where Mr. Nine had Zoro restrained around his arm, and you're thinking, okay, great, they have him restrained, they can actually do something here. And no, we proceed to see Zoro use Mr. Nine as a tetherball. He's getting knocked into the buildings over here, he's getting slammed over there. It's really honestly pretty pathetic. The worst thing that happened to Zoro in this fight was the moment where he had to cut a barrel of beer in half, thus wasting it. And for that, we give it ranking number 13. Number 12, the Humandrels, or baboons if you prefer. And just like that, we have our second jumping on the list. There's actually not much to say about this fight in particular. Most of what we can say about this fight is what we can glean from the actual combatants themselves. It was a one versus all scenario, so inherently, much like the Baroque Works fight, that played into a factor of being a logistical challenge for Zoro. One thing that we saw from the Humandrels that we didn't see from Baroque Works is the fact that the Humandrels were actually pretty durable. We see one of them take a direct onigiri slash from Zoro, and this Humandrel's idea of first aid was licking his finger and rubbing it into the wound. If they all had that same level of durability, I'd see it being a little difficult for Zoro to actually close out the fight with every single baboon. So on top of being absolute tanks, tanking named attacks like onigiri, Mihawk also lets us know that these baboons were quite adept at using human weapons because they were raised around war. If we look at this little shot here, we see a variety of weapons here. There's guns, there's axes, there's swords, and they even have a spear. There's actually a variety of weapons Zoro actually had to deal with in this fight as well. When Zoro goes to report that he beat all the Humandrels, we do see like a little drop of blood coming out of him, so I mean, they did something. I'm not going to say it's a lot, but they did something. Zoro was completely wrapped in bandages coming off of his encounter with Kuma on Thriller Bark, as well as all the stuff that happened on Sabaody. And for all those reasons, the Humandrels take number 12. Number 11, Nyanban Brothers. Nyanban? I don't know if I'm saying that right. Nyanban Brothers. The Cat Brothers, okay? Don't let the Halloween Express looking costumes fool you. This is actually one of the first fights where Zoro has somewhat of a challenge. This is actually one of the few fights in the series where Zoro was completely unharmed. This was before he even fought Mihawk, so he had no major injuries going into the fight. Sham is able to disarm Zoro by getting the jump on him and taking two of his swords, so immediately forcing Zoro to have to use one sword style. That's going to make it a lot harder for him right off the rip. We actually see the brothers giving Zoro some difficulty here in one sword style. So as they're clashing blades, they're actually advancing on Zoro, so they clearly had the advantage. And at one point, we even see Zoro think to himself that if he just had one more sword, he'd be able to handle this fight a lot easier. So on top of them pressing here in one sword style, Sham was actually able to get the jump on Zoro and restrain him, so he couldn't move. So much in fact that Bucci was able to jump up and crack the ground where Zoro was sitting. Zoro did end up dodging this attack, so we can't give them points for that, but they did restrain him and they put a little pressure on him. Zoro even commented on the strength of this attack, saying that if he got hit with that, he'd be squished like a pancake. So this is one of our first instances of something that was external from the actual fight happening that made it a little harder for Zoro. Usopp tries to help, but instead of helping, Zoro actually blocks that attack. And when he blocks that attack, it opens them up for a strike from the brothers. They actually draw some blood here. All that said, while the brothers did provide somewhat of a challenge to Zoro, once Zoro gets all three swords back here, the brothers no longer really seem to be a factor. In fact, they were taken out by one named attack. So after they get taken down, Bucci asks Django to hypnotize him, which does give Bucci a bit of a zombie amp, so he has a lot more power here where you see him smashing things even harder than he did before, and he's able to clash with Zoro and throw him out of the way in addition to that. He was able to overpower Zoro a little bit here, but Zoro still ended that pretty quickly. So number 11 is about as far as the Nyanban brothers are going to make it on this list. Number 10, Kabaji. Zoro was actually pretty hurt in this fight. In fact, he was coming off of a fresh wound where he got completely impaled by Buggy just earlier in the same arc. Kabaji even commented on the fact that he was surprised that Zoro could still be standing after such a wound. So the reason this fight cracks number 10 here isn't because Kabaji himself was particularly impressive strength-wise, but the tactics he actually used in this fight were pretty brutal. We see Kabaji make two direct hits in Zoro's wound that he just got from Buggy. The first time was when Kabaji used his fire breath, forcing Zoro to dodge, and as Zoro was dodging and he was off balance, Kabaji took advantage of that and hit Zoro directly in his wound. Right after getting hit with this, Zoro is screaming in absolute agony. This man is on the ground. And Kabaji wastes pretty much no time at all. He immediately goes up while Zoro is on the ground, and he goes for a second strike in the wound where he actually does connect. And once again, we see Zoro screaming in agony here. So eventually Zoro got tired of the game, so he himself took his sword and cut himself right in the same wound that Kabaji was taking advantage of, which what I assume to be on a mental basis prevented Kabaji from going for any more strikes there. So after a few more failed attempts from Kabaji to land more blows on Zoro, and a completely negated assist from Buggy blocked by Luffy, Zoro closes this one out with an onigiri. Number 9. Ryuma. Facing off against a zombified version of his ancestor, Zoro has what is his first evenly matched fight on the list. The fight starts with Zoro blocking a hit intended for Frankie and Brook, with Zoro saying he was excited to meet the samurai. We see Zoro say that he's limited to only 2 swords in this fight. And the reason for this is because Zoro had one of his swords rusted at Annie's lobby when he fought Shu. Before they even fight, Ryuma kind of gives Zoro props here and says that Zoro seems strong. And Zoro remarks on Ryuma appearing to be what in his eyes he calls a giant beast. So after all this chatter back and forth, we see Ryuma using one of Brook's attacks. Zoro dodges out of the way, and then when we come back to the fight, we see that Zoro actually responded with a strike of his own, where Ryuma barely dodges the slash as well. We even see Ryuma comment on the fact that they were evenly matched after this exchange, further cementing the idea that this is supposed to be an evenly matched fight. So the two go sword for sword here, clashing blades, really not making any clear connections on either side. But there is a point where Zoro was fearful of his swords breaking because he realizes Ryuma is using sword breaking strikes. And after having already lost one sword, I'm sure Zoro wasn't trying to lose another. They eventually break out from within the castle that they were fighting of, so they're now fighting on this triangular shaped roof, which doesn't provide the greatest footing. We even see Brook comment on the fact that they were fighting so well despite having horrible footing to fight on. We see Zoro sliding down a little bit, so again, something a little hard that he logistically has to work through here as he fights with Ryuma. One thing I do want to take note of here, we do see Ryuma and Zoro huffing a bit, so it implies they're exerting some amount of effort in order to overcome the other person. Ryuma takes a swipe at the roof, completely bisecting it. Zoro grabs onto the top of the roof with 2 of his swords to make sure he doesn't fall, and it's at this point where Zoro takes the high ground. And we see Zoro take complete advantage of this high ground, as him and Ryuma have their final clash with named attacks on each side, and Ryuma being the one who gets cut. So with this being an even fight throughout the match, the difficult terrain, Ryuma's general skill and tactics, the only thing really holding this fight from being higher on the list was the fact that there was only one hit connected, and that hit was from Zoro to Ryuma. So we're gonna leave this one at number 9. Number 8. Brahim. So we have another fight where Zoro was in fairly good shape to start. The biggest struggle Zoro encountered in this fight was the versatility coming from Brahim. Brahim was wearing these waver kind of skates so he can move around and really mix up Zoro. He had these flashless pistols that anytime they were used, it would impact Zoro's sight enough to where he couldn't tell where Brahim was going next. Brahim was also able to catch Zoro off guard with the Milky Dial by doing a pretty quick approach. So to confirm these are in fact factors for Zoro that he sees that he has to overcome, Zoro himself comments on how fast he is and also the efficacy of the pistols. He's saying, I can't even keep track of this guy every time these pistols go off. Brahim was able to dodge attacks from Zoro just because of how fast he was. He was even able to force Zoro into a bad position. Zoro was trying to strike at Brahim in midair, and instead of dodging or turning back, Brahim just takes it upon himself to use the Milky Dial to approach him and directly meet Zoro head on. As Zoro attempts to dodge the gunfire here, he kind of turns his positioning, and when he's falling, he gets distracted by this eel and he cuts it in half. Zoro's sitting there looking at the eel that he just cut in half in a sense of wonderment, and Brahim immediately wastes no time and pops Zoro on the leg. We even see Zoro think to himself again how he needs to handle his speed, and also the fact that the light from the pistols is still getting in the way. In an expert Zoro fashion, Zoro realizes he has to do something about the fight, so what does he do? He uses his 36-pound Phoenix, and he ends the fight in one hit. So while Zoro was getting pretty mixed up with the versatility of Brahim's kit, Zoro was able to finish this off with one 36-pound Phoenix by surprising Brahim and knocking him out in one blow. So we're gonna have to give this one number 8. Number 7, Pika. While this fight was more like a hazardous game of hide and seek, its difficulty can't be denied. In every stat, Zoro completely outclasses Pika. However, Pika is an incredibly difficult person to land a hit on. And this is due to Pika's ability to go throughout whatever stone he's manipulating, so his actual body is not something that's easy to identify as he's moving around through the stone. Pika did a great job giving Zoro some cardio in, as they fought pretty much all over Dressrosa. They fought at the Dressrosa Palace, they fought at the Pika statue, the Old Royal Plateau, and the King's Plateau. On top of being incredibly hard to pin down, Zoro also needed external help with this fight. He got Orlumbus, one of the contestants from earlier in the arc at the Coliseum, and he pretty much just had Orlumbus throw him with his killer bowling technique at the big statue of Pika that was terrorizing the main part of the town. Once Zoro actually got close enough to cut Pika, boy did he cut Pika. He completely bisected this man in half, and then when he realized that Pika was moving around the stone to not get hit, he cut that into another section. He continued to cut until Pika was forced to come out physically and try to handle Zoro himself, which obviously didn't happen. So for nothing else, this fight gets a number 7 spot just for the sheer amount of effort needed to land a hit on Pika and actually finish the fight. Number 6, Home. This fight happened in Skypiea, just like the Braham arc, so Zoro is coming off of that. He had a little bit of a leg injury with the bullet, but that didn't really seem to affect Zoro too much in this fight. There were far too many distractions for Zoro in this fight for this not to make it as high as it does on the list. We had the giant serpent getting in the way, we had Viper needlessly attacking Zoro at random points during the fight, and we saw Zoro get distracted by other Straw Hats when he noticed they were in danger. When Zoro noticed Chopper was laying on the ground incapacitated, like the good reindeer dad, Zoro rushed over to help, and he immediately stepped on one of the traps that triggered this barbed wire material to cut Zoro on his side. And these iron cloud traps are no joke. Just look at the amount of blood that comes out whenever Zoro gets sideswiped by one of these things. We didn't actually see this come into play again with the traps, but just because the traps are there, we're going to count that as a point, because the battlefield is essentially a minefield that only Ohm knows how to navigate. We didn't actually see this happen on panel, but Ohm was able to strike Zoro again in his wound, and Zoro was asking, wait, how did you do that? And this strike on Zoro was actually strong enough to have Zoro on his knees. Between the versatility of Ohm's Cloud Sword, which could change size, shape, and direction at will, Ohm also had a little something called mantra. And these two things work together to make it seem like Zoro had no ability to dodge any of Ohm's attacks. When Nami gets swallowed by the serpent, we see Zoro get distracted again. It was with this distraction that Ohm landed a clean hit on Zoro's chest with the Cloud Sword. Even when we see Zoro try to go on the offense in this fight, Ohm just turns his Cloud Sword into a little square and completely blocks Zoro's attack. This guy had an insane amount of tools under his belt. Again, just like Braham got defeated at one strike, Zoro just upped the voltage on that very same attack, and that was the rest of what we heard from Ohm in that arc. We have reached the point in the video where we're going over that manga spoiler fight, so if you are anime only and would like to skip this section of the video, please go to this timestamp and you can continue spoiler free. Now with that out of the way, number 5, Lucci. Unfortunately, most of this fight was off screen, so what we can gather is pretty much from the surrounding factors that happened within the arc. This is the precise reason why we had a spoiler warning, because we're about to spoil the entire Egghead arc with this. This fight took a tremendously long time. So long, this is a list of all the things that happened when the fight started. The Lucci and Zoro fight started at the same time as the Luffy and Kizaru fight. We saw the conclusion of Luffy and Kizaru's fight. We saw Saturn spawn into the island. We saw the Marines evacuate for the Buster Call. Brook and Lilith moved the Sunny. Bonnie took over all the pacifistas. Vegapunk got stabbed and lasered. The Giant showed up. Luffy and Kizaru got back up, and then they fought again along with Saturn. All of these things throughout the entire arc was happening while Zoro and Lucci were fighting. And it's not as if Zoro was just playing with his food here. At the start of the fight, he knew that Luffy was fighting Kizaru. Zoro's not going to play around with Lucci when he knows Kizaru is on the island and actively engaging with his captain. So with all that said, I'm pretty sure this is the longest continuous fight in the entire series of One Piece for Zoro. As we flash between the Lucci fight and other things happening on the island, we do see that Zoro was huffing and wheezing along with Lucci at the same time, so they're more or less evenly matched with Zoro and his two-sword style here. Zoro makes a comment himself on how Lucci is just way too resilient, and he's like, dude, I got stuff to do. Like, you need to get down so I can get out of here, do something else. Zoro didn't actually finish this fight until he went in the three-sword style and then hit Lucci with a named attack. So while Zoro didn't really seem to take much damage in this fight, it took a tremendously amount of effort and a tremendous amount of time. So for that, we're going to give this one number 5. Number 4, Killer and Yukimaru. This is one of those fights where both of the combatants were fairly evenly matched. Zoro coming into this fight was also fairly fresh. However, the biggest difference maker in this fight was the fact that Yukimaru was there to basically tip the scales. What basically was a pretty even fight, while Yukimaru tried to have it thee at Zoro, forcing him to dodge, and Killer immediately just taking a chunk out of Zoro. We did have this extremely cold moment with Zoro where he just forced the scythe to stay inside of his shoulder and go from having to use two-sword style to three-sword style, so his own weird makeshift version of three-sword style. And he ended things here with a Purgatory Onigiri. What gives this fight a little more credit is immediately after the fight, we see Zoro just pass out. And that's not something we see Zoro do very often in this series. Number 3, Kaku. This fight is easily one of Zoro's hardest in the series. Between Kaku's base form and his hybrid form, he uses all 6 styles of the Rokushiki. Kaku specialized in the Tempest Kick, so that, along with his 2 swords, he dubbed the 4-sword style. When the fight first started, we did see Zoro using 2-sword style, but that didn't last very long. as Zoro quickly transferred over into three-sword style. So just like in the Ryuma fight we talked about earlier, we see a series of clashes and named attacks that don't actually connect on either opponent. After a short time of really making no progress at all, Kaku decides to transform, which he inadvertently transforms into his full draft transformation. It is at this point that Zoro and Kaku break through the floor where they meet Usopp and Jabra, and this completely derails the fight. There's not actually much of a fight that goes on here because we see Jabra and Kaku arguing about whose prey is who, and then of course Usopp and Zoro are running around handcuffed, just being complete goofballs. Eventually, Zoro and Kaku do resume their one-on-one as they get separated, and it is from this point forward that Kaku is in his hybrid form. Despite being so big, Kaku's actually pretty nimble. We see him dodging a lot of strikes from Zoro, using his neck really to kind of move around like this and not get hit whenever Zoro makes a cut at him. Shortly into the fight, as Kaku is in his hybrid form, we see Zoro put on his infamous bandana in a way to indicate that he is indeed taking the fight seriously from this point forward. While neither side took any damage in their initial scuffle while Kaku was in his base form, this is where Zoro starts to eat quite a bit of damage. Kaku goes in this little Roblox looking form while he's using Iron Body and does a flurry of kicks towards the ceiling. These kicks end up raining down on Zoro, and Zoro states that they're too hard to dodge because there's so many of them. He's getting cut up left and right with these kicks coming from the ceiling. While blocking Kaku's giraffe blast, Zoro gets flung completely across the room. Giraffe blast is... it's okay. I love Kaku. I do love Kaku, but that's just ridiculous. I'm sorry. We also see Zoro eat what is essentially two named attacks from Kaku that mimic Luffy's Gum Gum Gatling, but with his giraffe neck. Once again, in typical Zoro fashion, he ends his fight with one hit, and one hit landed only. But this time, it is the 9-sword style. And for that, Kaku, we give you number 3. Number 2, King. This fight left Zoro with way too much to think about, and honestly, he was getting fairly bullied in the front half of this fight. Zoro had to figure out the trick to King's flames, eventually figuring out that flames on means durability is high, and flames off means it's more speed focused. King would fly around, making him an incredibly hard target to hit. Even with the air slashes Zoro had, he couldn't connect any of those. King would just pull a Star Fox barrel roll and dodge them completely. King had these little arrows he would shoot at Zoro while he was flying, so that add more pressure. His own sword he got in this arc, Enma, even acted as a distraction for him, just out there jacking this man's hockey. He did end up accepting Enma's hockey withdrawals, however that did come with putting a strict timeline on the fight, as you can't fight forever as your hockey's getting drained out. Before figuring out King's ability and actually mastering Enma, Zoro lands several named attacks on King that have no effect at all. Having to figure out that flame on versus flame off style was something Zoro had to work around in this fight. King had these flame dragons Zoro had to mess around with, cut through, whatever have you. He hit him with this little, well, actually looking attack where he would pull his head back and then just completely decimate whatever Zoro was standing on. There was a point when Zoro got hit on his side with this same attack. When he dodged the first one, he said if he had gotten hit directly with that with no hockey, it would have killed him. So again, acknowledging just how serious of a threat King actually was. Any opening at all, King went for it. Not only did King go for these openings, he had no issue creating the openings himself. One of the first things King actually did is he has this ability to serrate the edges of his blade, and he used that to disarm 2 of Zoro's swords. He got him back pretty quickly, so it wasn't the biggest hurdle in the world, but yet again, another thing in King's bag of tricks that Zoro had to deal with. He also had these air slashes he could do when he was in his pterodon form, and these slashes were no joke either. They were so strong that Zoro blocked one and he still got sent flying so far that Frankie had to catch him. And just to show how serious Zoro was throughout this entire fight, he actually started this fight in 3-sword style. In order to finally clutch that W over King, Zoro did have to accept Enma and all of his hockey withdrawal so he can tap into his Conqueror's hockey and land some really good hits on King to close it out. Zoro had to deal with a lot of stuff in this fight that he also had to deal with in pretty much every other fight. The only thing separating this fight from number 1, in my opinion, is complete and utter domination. Number 1, Mr. 1. This fight stands atop of the One Piece series as Zoro's first major hurdle in the Grand Line. And that is the title that comes with good reason. With Mr. 1's body being completely made out of steel due to the dice fruit, made him uncuttable by swordsmen. This fight serves as Zoro's coming to age story as a swordsman, where he finally learns how to cut steel. On the way to learning cutting steel, we see Mr. 1 and Zoro trading strikes. Even when Zoro does land a hit on Mr. 1, it's pretty ineffective because at this point in the fight, he doesn't know how to cut steel. Mr. 1 took advantage of the fact that Zoro actually couldn't touch him in this fight, and he basically pushed this man into a building. Zoro was so desperate in this fight to land a hit, he picked up a building and threw it at Mr. 1, and he still got parried. This man diced up the building and hit Zoro immediately in response. The first attack that Mr. 1 actually collects a blood donation from Zoro is with his blood saws. He lands a direct hit in Zoro's midsection. Mr. One follows up with another direct hit with the buzzsaws. Mr. One then uses some spike claws to knock Zoro into a building. This fight at this point is complete and utter domination. So much so we've never seen Zoro get dominated as hard as he did in this fight. He was laying on the ground next to a building. He musters just enough strength to turn around and face Mr. One as Mr. One cuts him in the building right behind him. This man wasn't even worried about blocking. He was worried about his honor, just not getting cut in the back. That was the only reason why he turned around there. At the depths of turmoil in this fight, Zoro reflects on the teachings of his sensei, and for the first time, he hears. He hears the breathing of all things, the trees, the rocks. He lines up his one sword style line strike, and he cuts steel for the first time. Thank you for sticking around this far in the video. If you liked it, please leave a like, and if you have a comment about how you would change the list or how you would rank these fights, please let me know. And if you want to see more, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and I'll see you on the next one.